What if the most dangerous secret of the British monarchy was never buried with Princess Diana, but protected, rewritten, and deliberately obscured for decades? For more than 25 years, the world has been told that Diana's death was a tragic accident, a catastrophic convergence of speed, paparazzi pressure, and fate. Case closed, files sealed, silence enforced. But tonight, that official narrative cracks open in a way it never has before. Because according to sources now circulating inside royal circles, King Charles has finally acknowledged a truth he has avoided for a generation. Not a confession in the legal sense, not a courtroom statement, but something far more unsettling. An admission, delivered behind closed doors, about who initiated the chain of decisions that made that night in Paris so dangerously inevitable. This is not about re-describing the crash. It is about power, about influence, about what happens when fear of exposure collides with ambition, jealousy, and the ruthless instinct to protect status at any cost. Multiple insiders describe a growing rift inside the palace in recent months, one that forced Charles into an impossible position. As old files resurfaced and private conversations were re-examined, attention did not drift outward. It narrowed inward, towards someone who had everything to lose if Diana remained alive, vocal and uncontained, someone whose rise depended on Diana's silence, someone whose role has always been minimized publicly, yet fiercely defended privately. Camilla. For years, her name has hovered at the edges of every serious inquiry, always dismissed, never fully addressed. But now, sources claim Charles has privately conceded that Diana's death was not merely an accident of circumstance, but the outcome of calculated pressure applied at the highest levels. Pressure that did not require orders written on paper, only intent, influence, and deniability. If this is true, it would not only redefine Diana's final chapter, it would expose a moral collapse at the core of the modern monarchy. So the question is no longer what happened in that tunnel. The question is this: who truly set events in motion, and why has the truth been buried for so long? Stay with us, because once you see how the pieces align, the official story may never feel believable again. Diana entered the British royal family at a very young age. She did not enter with full preparation. She entered with the simple belief that marriage would eventually bring love. That was what Diana believed. And it was also the first thing that wounded her, that marriage was not built on understanding. It was arranged to fit the institution. A young girl, a man carrying the burden of succession, and a choice considered safe for the royal family. From the very first days, Diana felt the emptiness. Charles was not present in the marriage in the way a husband should be. He was polite, proper, but distant. His gaze never lingered. Conversations ended quickly. Dinners passed in silence. Diana realized very early that Charles's heart had never belonged to her. He was present in formality, but his mind was elsewhere. Camilla did not appear as a loud figure. There were no direct confrontations, no public declarations, but she was always there, like something everyone knew but no one spoke of. A relationship that never truly ended, a bond stronger than the official marriage. To Charles, Camilla was comfort. She was trust. She was where he returned. And that made Diana understand that she was only a substitute. Diana's pain did not come from a single shock. It accumulated day by day, from long nights alone in the vast palace, from the feeling of being lost among cold walls, from having to appear before the public for public with a perfect smile, while behind closed doors. No one asked what she was thinking. No one listened to how she felt. Diana tried. She tried to become a proper princess, tried to follow the rules, tried not to cause trouble. She learned to stay silent at banquets, learned not to ask questions, learned to accept that she was not chosen. Deep inside, Diana wondered if she were obedient enough, if she were patient enough, would anything change? There were brief exchanges between Diana and Charles, not arguments, but coldness, short replies, avoiding eyes. Diana realized that the most painful thing was not public betrayal. It was the feeling of being abandoned within her own marriage. She was a wife in title, but not the one chosen in reality. The royal family saw that pain, but they did not intervene. Because to them, Diana was fulfilling her role. She appeared flawless. She was loved by the public, and that was enough. Her emotions were not a priority. Her personal happiness was not something to be protected. Diana gradually understood that in this system, she existed to maintain an image, not to be happy. Camilla remained there, quiet, steady, without needing to compete, because she had never been removed. That made Diana feel as if she were fighting something invisible, an opponent who never appeared, but never disappeared. That presence wore Diana down day by day, making her doubt her own worth. There were nights when Diana lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick, and wondering where she had gone wrong. She did not publicly blame anyone. She withdrew into herself, tried to endure, tried to adapt, tried to believe that her silence would be acknowledged, that if she did not make noise, if she did not resist, perhaps they would choose her. Diana once thought, if I stay silent, will they choose me? That was not the question of an ambitious woman. It was the question of someone trying to survive in a marriage with no room for her emotions. But Diana was not someone who could remain silent forever. And that was what opened the next tragic chapter. When Diana decided to speak, it was no longer the act of a wounded wife. It was a turning point that pushed the entire royal family into a defensive position. For a long time, Diana had been silent, endured, adapted. But that silence did not bring safety. It only isolated her further, controlled her more tightly, and pushed her farther away from the center of power. Diana's decision to tell the truth did not come from impulse. It was the result of years of psychological pressure. Diana understood that if she continued to stay silent, she would slowly disappear. Not physically, but in voice, and to Diana, that was unacceptable. She did not want to be remembered as a well-behaved princess. She wanted to be seen as a human being with emotions, with pain, and with the right to speak. Diana's interviews stunned the royal family, not because she accused anyone directly, but because the way she told her story was too real, too specific, too ordinary. Diana did not create a script. She simply told what she had lived through: a cold marriage, a system of silent control, a constant feeling of being watched and judged. Diana did not speak only about Charles's affair. She spoke about being isolated within the royal family itself, cut off from the people she trusted, placed into a rigid mold she was expected to obey. She spoke about prolonged psychological pressure, about sleepless nights, about the feeling of not being protected. Those were the things that truly worried the royal family, because this was no longer a personal matter. This was a story about how an institution treats the human beings inside it. The public listened to Diana, not out of curiosity, but because they believed her. Diana spoke from real experience, with emotions left uncovered, and with a kind of pain that anyone could recognize. Meanwhile, Charles appeared stiff, avoidant, and emotionally distant. That contrast caused the balance of trust to shift decisively toward Diana. The media began to change its tone. Diana was no longer seen as a troublesome wife. She became someone brave enough to speak the truth, someone willing to admit imperfection, but unwilling to accept being treated like a decorative object. This caused the royal family to lose control of the narrative. For the first time, their image was no longer defined from within. Diana gradually became the most trusted voice when speaking about the royal family. This was extremely dangerous for a system that survives on image and ritual. A woman once viewed as fragile now had the power to shape public opinion. Through words alone, through her own truth. Public affection for Diana did not fade. It grew. People saw in her a sense of closeness, genuine vulnerability, and courage. Meanwhile, Charles and those around him began to face questions, not because they were clearly guilty of wrongdoing, but because they did not speak enough, did not explain enough, and did not show enough empathy. Diana did not stop speaking. She did not seek to destroy anyone, but every time she spoke, another piece of truth was revealed, and each piece weakened the shell of stability the royal family worked to preserve. Diana understood the power of words, and she understood that she now stood in a position no one had occupied before. A woman like that, if she continued to live and continued to speak, what would that lead to? This was no longer a speculative question. It was a present concern, because Diana did not only know about personal relationships, she knew how the system functioned. She knew who stayed silent when they should speak. She knew who was protected and who was abandoned. The most dangerous thing was not what Diana had already said. It was what she could still say. In a system accustomed to controlling information, the existence of a living witness, trusted by the public, could not be taken lightly. Diana did not hide an ambition to dismantle the royal family, but her honesty unintentionally did exactly that. She became a threat not because she attacked, but because she was no longer afraid. And when someone is no longer afraid, power begins to lose its advantage. And when Diana knew too much, the question was no longer whether she was safe, but who felt threatened. The night of August the 31st, 1997 did not begin with tragedy. It began with small decisions, decisions that seemed ordinary. But when reviewed later, people realized that this chain of choices led to an irreversible outcome. Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed were in Paris during the final days of their holiday. They were staying at the Ritz Hotel. This was a familiar location, with its own security system, with pre-planned travel routes. Initially, the plan was to stay at the hotel overnight. There was no indication that leaving was necessary. However, late in the evening, another decision was made. Diana and Dodi would leave the Ritz and return to Dodi's private apartment. This decision completely altered the original security plan. Instead of using the main entrance, a rear exit was chosen. The explanation given was to avoid the attention of photographers. The departure happened later than expected. This meant that backup arrangements were not fully prepared. The accompanying security team was reduced. There were no official escort vehicles in front or behind. The driver was Henri Paul, who was working off duty at the time. The car left the Ritz without the standard security formation. Diana sat in the back seat. Dodi sat beside her. Those who later reviewed the situation confirmed that there was no obvious tension inside the car at the moment of departure. There was no sign that they anticipated any danger. After leaving the hotel, some photographers began to follow. This was not unusual. Diana had lived with their presence for years. However, the level of pursuit that night remains disputed. Some sources claim the photographers followed closely behind. Others say the distance was not excessive. There is no complete footage to confirm this precisely. The speed of the car became the first major point of contradiction. Some early reports claimed the car was traveling at very high speed, but other reports suggested much lower figures. No publicly released technical data exists to verify the speed. Conclusions were largely based on estimates and indirect testimony. The car continued through several central Paris routes. The path was not fixed. It differed from the original route. There is no clear documentation explaining this change. What is known is that the car moved toward the Pont de l'Alma area shortly after leaving the Ritz. When the car entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the crash occurred. The timing was recorded precisely, but the seconds immediately before the impact were not captured by direct footage. Security cameras in the area did not provide clear images of the critical moment. This is a major point of suspicion, because this area was normally under surveillance. Immediately after the crash, the scene was observed by many witnesses. However, their accounts were not entirely consistent. Some heard a loud impact. Others only saw the car already stopped afterward. Some witnesses initially gave fairly detailed statements, but later adjusted certain parts of their testimony. Diana was removed from the car while still alive. This is one of the few points of agreement. Medical personnel at the scene provided emergency treatment. The decision not to move the victim immediately was explained as an effort to stabilize her condition. However, how long on-site treatment lasted and whether that time could have been shortened remains a subject of debate. Dodi Al-Fayed and Henri Paul died at the scene. This created serious difficulty in clarifying the final minutes inside the car. Those who directly made decisions about the route, the speed, and the reaction in the crucial moment were no longer able to explain. Investigations were carried out afterward. Multiple agencies were involved. Many reports were released. But even in official conclusions, there remain points that could not be confirmed with absolute certainty, not because of a lack of investigative effort, but because of missing data that could not be recovered. Cameras did not function at the critical moment. Speed data lacked an independent measurement source. Witnesses were not fully consistent. The route was changed at the last minute. The security detail was incomplete. Each detail on its own could be explained, but when placed side by side, they create the sense that an important piece of the picture is still missing. Over time, some information was added, some details became clearer, but there are also questions that never received definitive answers, not because no one asked them, but because there was no way to verify moments that had already passed. The night of August 31st, 1997, therefore exists not only as a traffic accident, it exists as a sequence of facts that never fully align. Each time the public revisits it, old details are viewed from new angles, but the sense of incompleteness remains. And that is what has led to decades of lingering doubt, not because of the collision itself, not because of the tunnel, but because after all the investigations, too many questions remain unanswered. For the public, the deepest suspicion does not lie in what happened that night. It lies in how everything was handled, how it was responded to, and how it was ultimately closed. When Princess Diana died, the world focused on one single question. Why did it happen? But within the British royal family, another question quietly existed. What did that death change? Not emotionally, but in terms of order, image, and relationships once considered unacceptable. Before Diana died, Charles and Camilla existed in a half-hidden state. Their relationship was no longer an absolute secret, but it could not step fully into the open. Diana was still alive, still the mother of the heir to the throne, still a moral symbol in the eyes of the public. Her presence placed every choice Charles made under judgment. He could love Camilla, but not openly. He could remain attached, but not with legitimacy. Camilla at that time carried the image of a woman on the margins. She appeared infrequently, was not welcomed, was not spoken of with warmth. The press mentioned her with caution or irony. The public did not forget what Diana had endured in that marriage. And Camilla, no matter how silent she was still seen as the cause. Diana's death changed that entire context. Not immediately. There was no official statement declaring that everything was different. But step by step, the space surrounding Charles and Camilla began to shift. In the first months after the tragedy, the royal family maintained a cautious stance. Camilla almost disappeared from the media. Charles appeared as a grieving father, a man who had lost his former wife in a tragedy that shocked the world. This period was crucial. It laid the foundation for sympathy. When pain is acknowledged, criticism gradually recedes. After that, the media began to change its tone. Camilla was no longer described harshly as the other woman. Articles shifted towards speaking of a long-lasting relationship, of a love that had endured for decades, of how Charles had never truly left Camilla emotionally. Details once seen as evidence of betrayal were now presented as a story of fate. Camilla gradually reappeared, at first in discreet settings, private meetings, unofficial events. Each appearance was carefully calculated, not too prominent, not placed at the center, but enough for the public to become accustomed to her presence beside Charles. What is notable is that public reaction was no longer as fierce as before, when his opposition still existed, but it was no longer unified, no longer explosive, partly because time had passed, partly because Diana was no longer alive for comparison. When a symbol is no longer present, memory begins to be retold in many different ways. Charles was no longer placed in direct confrontation with Diana's image. He was no longer the husband abandoning a woman who was still alive. He became a man who had made mistakes, but had paid for them through loss. This narrative created a moral vacuum, and within that vacuum, Camilla found a place. No one declared that Diana's death paved the way for a new marriage, but the reality is, only when Diana was gone could Charles and Camilla move forward legally. There were no longer ceremonial barriers, no longer pressure from the image of a wounded former wife, no longer the risk of daily direct comparison. The marriage of Charles and Camilla was later described as the end of a long journey. The media used softer language. The public was guided to view the relationship as inevitable, a conclusion that time had proven to be enduring. Diana's suffering was gradually pushed into the past, like a chapter that had closed. When Camilla became queen, very few people still raised the question that had once been the most controversial. If Diana were still alive, could this have happened? The question no longer required an answer, because reality itself had answered it. Only after Diana's death did all doors open. The irony lies here. There is no evidence that power had to act, no sign that anyone needed to intervene directly, but power does not always need to act. Sometimes it only needs to wait until circumstances rearrange themselves in the most favorable way. The prolonged silence of the royal family also played an important role in that process. There was no full explanation, no public dialogue about the warnings Diana had once given. That silence was not accidental. It prevented the story from being examined further. It allowed memory to be managed. It let difficult questions fade with time. Charles and Camilla were not the only ones to benefit from this shift. The British royal family also regained stability. There was no longer a figure capable of drawing attention and raising uncomfortable questions like Diana. Order was restored. Image was adjusted. Cracks were covered by ritual and by time. However, when looking back at the entire process, it is impossible not to ask, what deadlocks did Diana's death resolve? It resolved Charles's moral deadlock. It resolved Camilla's image deadlock. It resolved the royal family's media deadlock. Things that were once impossible suddenly became possible. This does not mean asserting that anyone caused her death, but it reveals a cold truth. Some outcomes only appear when a person is no longer present. And in this case, Diana's absence created a new order, one more favorable to those who remained. But the greatest price of that silence was not paid by Charles or Camilla. On the day Princess Diana died, William and Harry did not only lose their mother, they also lost the right to grieve like ordinary children. Two boys who had not yet fully understood the meaning of death were forced to step before the world, walking behind their mother's coffin, in front of millions of lenses, within a carefully arranged silence. That image became a shared memory of humanity. But for William and Harry, it was a personal memory that could never be erased. A morning when childhood ended, a moment when pain was not allowed to be shown. They were taught that they had to walk straight, had to keep their faces composed, had to represent the royal family. While inside, both were children in panic. William was the elder brother. From that moment, he understood that he had no choice. He was the heir. Every action he took carried symbolic meaning. If he collapsed, the institution collapsed with him. William's silence did not begin in adulthood. It began on the day he was forced to grow up too soon. William chose to control his emotions. He did not speak much, did not react strongly, did not reveal what was happening inside. He learned to live with pain through discipline, through duty, through placing the interests of the royal family above personal emotion. Not because he did not hurt, but because he did not allow himself to break. Harry was different. Harry was the younger child, and the one not prepared for the role of heir. Harry's pain was not framed by responsibility. It existed more freely, and for that reason, more chaotically. Harry did not understand why he had to be silent, did not understand why no one told him the full truth, did not understand why his mother was gone, while everything else quickly returned to the old order. For many years, Harry carried a nameless anger. He rebelled. He tried to escape. He spoke the things William could not say. Every action Harry took was labeled as trouble, but few saw that this was the only way he knew to save himself from the feeling of being abandoned a second time. William chose to stay to protect the system. Harry chose to leave to protect himself. Neither of them chose the easier path. William had to accept living under constant control. Harry had to accept trading away status and security. Both were direct consequences of the same tragedy. What must be said is that both William and Harry were not allowed to fully speak about their mother for many years. Diana became a symbol, but that symbol was told in a way that was safe for the royal family. Her real suffering, the warning she once gave, the psychological wounds she endured, all of it was blurred. William understood that, and he chose to accept it. He believed that protecting the institution was also a way of protecting his mother's memory, at least in the only way he knew how. His silence was not because he did not remember, but because he feared that if he spoke, everything would spiral out of control. Harry could not endure that silence. To him, it was that very silence that had destroyed his mother psychologically long before the accident occurred. He did not want to repeat that cycle. He did not want his wife to live under similar pressure. He did not want his children to grow up in an environment where emotions were treated as weakness. When Harry decided to speak and to leave, the world saw him as a traitor. But from a psychological perspective, it was the act of someone who had never been healed. He was not fighting his brother, not fighting the royal family. He was fighting the fear that he would become another version of a silence that had lasted 3 decades. William and Harry therefore became two sides of the same wound. One concealed in order to survive, one exposed in order to breathe. Neither of them overcame their mother's death. They simply learned to go on in two different directions. There is a thought that both of them carry, even if it is never spoken, even if it is never publicly acknowledged. If our mother were still alive, everything would be different. Different in that they would not have to make the choices they make now. Different in that they could have grown up without carrying such a vast emptiness on their shoulders. But Diana is no longer alive, and the two boys of that time have become two men with opposing roles. One remains in the palace, one moves away from it, one continues the silence, one breaks it, and then we return to the man who has been silent the longest. 30 years have passed since Princess Diana left this world, long enough for controversies to cool, long enough for positions to change, long enough for a man once criticized to become king. Today, when we look back on that story, we are no longer standing in 1997. We are standing in the present, at a moment when King Charles is 75 years old. At that age, people usually stop running from questions, yet King Charles offers no answers. He does not say who caused Diana's death. He does not publicly deny the warnings Diana gave while she was alive. He chooses silence, a silence that has stretched from his days as Prince of Wales to his time as king. That silence is not loud. It does not shock. But precisely because of that, it forces people to pause and think. Because silence in this case does not mean there is nothing to say. It means there is too much that is not permitted to be said. If King Charles has known the truth for a long time, the first question is why he has remained silent, why he accepted carrying that truth for nearly 3 decades. Was the silence meant to protect his children, or to protect the image of the royal family, or to protect himself? Silence is sometimes not about fear, but about choice, Moaz. A choice made when the cost of truth is too high. But if King Charles does not know the truth, the question becomes even harder. Why would a man at the highest position not pursue answers to the end? Why would someone with power, with advisors, with an entire apparatus behind him, accept not knowing nothing? During the years Diana was alive, she spoke about control, isolation, psychological pressure. After her death, those questions did not disappear, but they were never fully pursued. Between those two possibilities, there is no comfortable answer. Whether he knew or did not know, the silence remains. And that silence has become part of royal history. It is not written into records. It does not appear in speeches, but it is present in how events were handled, in how Diana's memory has been told, in how her warnings have gradually been blurred. At the age of 75, King Charles is no longer a young man trapped between duty and emotion. He has lived through enough upheaval to understand that there are truths that cannot turn back time. Yet it is precisely at this moment that his silence takes on a different meaning. It is no longer avoidance. It is a legacy, a choice maintained to the very end. What invites reflection is that this silence did not affect Diana alone. It affected her children. It affected William. It affected Harry. It shaped the way two brothers grew up with the same wound but followed two different paths. It also affected the public. When a great story has no resolution, people are forced to live with doubt. There are deaths that are closed by written records. There are deaths that are closed by legal conclusions. But there are also deaths that never truly close, not because of a lack of evidence, but because too many layers of interest are intertwined around them. In Diana's case, the question does not lie in how fast the car was traveling or whether the cameras were functioning. Those questions have been repeated for many years. The question lies elsewhere. It lies in what happened after her death. Who found peace? Who was able to move forward? Who could rebuild an image? And who was forced to remain in memory as a symbol that was not allowed to change? When people look at the consequences, they realize that there are departures that resolve many deadlocks that no one dared to touch while the person was alive. This does not mean asserting that someone caused Diana's death, but it reveals a cold reality. There are deaths that do not require a clearly identified culprit. They only require the right circumstances. They only require silence to be maintained long enough. And they only require enough people to benefit from that absence. King Charles today may say nothing more about Diana, but his silence is precisely what ensures that the story has never truly ended. It forces each generation to ask the questions again and to seek their own answers, not through evidence, but by looking at what changed after Diana was gone. And perhaps the truth about Diana does not lie beneath a Paris tunnel, but within the silence that has stretched across 3 decades of the royal family.